studio in the wake of the CFR Sovereign Risk Index. What should we make of that? Dr. Jerry Combat Monfant is an external monetary policy advisor to EFRAG. Doc.
Yes, sir.
Good morning.
Fine morning, sir.
Nice to see you. It's been quite a long while.
Yeah, it's really been quite a long while.
You've been a very busy man.
Yes, I am. But what do I do?
It's nice to at least get still some time off your busy schedule to have a conversation with you on this matter.
That's good. Wonderful.
Yeah. Well, Doc, let's dive right into it.
Okay.
First of all, before I come to what the CFR is saying,
Yeah, that's right.
I think let's start from the perspective of the Ghanaian economy in general.
Yeah.
Are you also feeling this general price hikes that everybody is talking about? Because they usually say that when you're at a certain level, you're insulated from the price hikes until they get to a certain point. Mm-hmm. Do you see it?
Yeah, it is. To be very honest with you, I don't look at it from the point of view of price hikes,
okay,
but I look at it that Ghana has got into economic crisis.
We're in crisis?
Yeah, we're in crisis. We are in economic crisis. Economic crisis comes when people can no longer afford what they do usually afford. When situation become much more difficult than the standard deviations allow. And that is why we feel we are in economic crisis. It started with the financial crisis. Okay. Usually it's divided into two. Mm-hmm. We have financial crisis, and then we have economic crisis.
Okay.
Financial crisis leads to economic crisis.
Okay.
And the financial crisis was actually created by the government because of the very inconsistent and wrong policies that had been rolled out over the period. And that had led this country move into this level. If you remember somewhere, that was in 2019, the first time I held my public lecture, and I made it clear.
And the time we had the very first conversation.
Exactly, that's correct. And I made it quite clear that Ghana is heading to financial crisis. And after financial crisis, what is going to follow up is going to be economic crisis. And that is where we find ourselves too. I have the reason, the basis for saying this. One of the key incidents is that when your country keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, and at a point in time, the economy does not revolve itself to generate much more income to pay off the liabilities, but rather what the country does is possibly to go borrow from another end and come and pay maturing debt. That means the gaps is being created. Now, as the gap creates, there is a point, there's a tipping point. You'll get there and it will halt. And this is where we've got into now, it's halted. Since it's halted, we were looking at, if you look at the clear debt composition of the country, the debt composition of the country, we have bilateral, we have multilateral, and then we have the private and the bonds. Now, this composition should be able to tell you the risk of your country. This is the way it tells the risk of your country. If the bilateral and the multilateral dominate the loan portfolio, it tells you that when IMF comes in, your problem can be solved. Okay. But under these circumstances, we have the private and the bonds constituting about 60.7%.
60.7%?
Yes, 60.7% of the total loan composition. And then we have bilateral loan forming just about 13.5%. 13.5%. And then we have multilateral loans through the IMF, constituting about 26%.
Okay.
So therefore, if IMF would have to step in, the only foundation that they have would only be to look at the 26% and the 13%.
Okay.
That is trying to arrange the multilateral and the bilateral loan to make sure we can restructure it and reposition it. But when it comes to the bonds and the private debt, that constitutes about 60.7%. That is private individuals. IMF doesn't have influence over there. Okay. So if you go to IMF at this point, what you're going to do is that they can only handle just a bit less, about maybe 32 or 38% of your total debt portfolio. Okay. The remaining portfolio cannot be handled.
And that's the bigger part.
And that is the bigger part. Now there is one thing, there is a risk too. In case the government decide that, okay, we have to go to IMF, and if you go to IMF, the challenge that you're going to have now is that as soon as your 26% and 13.5% is restructured, the 60% you're going to have a serious problem within the capital market. That is in case that is even if you're allowed.
Okay.
Now, they would assume that you have defaulted and there had been restructuring through the IMF and the multilateral and the bilateral. And for that matter, nobody would be ready to even patronize your bonds anymore.
Okay.
And that will still bring you back to the same problem. It means that default will still be imminent.
Okay.
You know, so now the government is caught up itself in a web. There is a clear indication that when a country owes, if a country owes up to, let's say, 70% of your GDP and above, the clear risk about it is that the standard of living of your citizens reduces completely up to 0.16%. So that means that the standard of living started depreciating far ahead before the global downturn, or before the global challenges of having oil prices going up and having other things going up.
So by the time we hit 70%,
the time we hit 70%
of debt to GDP ratio,
of debt to GDP ratio, the standard of living,
our standard of living started to decline.
It starts to decline. That's a real aspect of it.
Okay.
And now the reason why it starts to decline is that one, it means that you need to up your revenue base as a country, and to up your revenue base as a country means that you have to increase taxes.
Okay.
Once you increase taxes, productivity driving becomes much more higher. It means the cost of products will become more higher.
Okay.
Because the tax component would have to be borne by the final consumer.
Okay.
And as far as it's going to be borne by the final consumer, that should tell you that your total spending power is going to be depreciated.
Okay.
Now, very quick enough, when I saw Steve Hank equally came out with a projection of the actual inflation rate of Ghana, that was around 45.6% of the Ghanaian descent. There is one other indicator that had not been mentioned, and that is what we call the depreciation of the currency.
Okay.
Now, the depreciation of the currency, of the Ghanaian currency, the sad aspect of it is that we mostly concentrate on the indicative rate at the Forex Bureau. That is how much has the cedi depreciated. Then we look at the Forex Bureau figures, and then we realize that, okay, when you go to the Forex to change it, it is the cedi to dollar is about 8 cedis to this. But in actual sense, so that is not, when you come to real economic factors, that's not the way we actually assess the falling of the currency.
Oh, so that's not assessment?
That is not assessment of the real currency, because this is how we assess currency. The way we assess currency is that if I pick a dollar, and if I pick a cedi per their unit, what can dollar buy and what can cedi buy? That is what we call the purchasing power parity. We want to look at the strength of our currency.
Okay.
And if you want to use that means, the cedi had depreciated more than 75% to almost getting to 80%. 75%
to 80%.
To almost 80% against the major currencies.
Just using the dollar against
you are using
how much can they
you
buy?
are looking at the market. For example, if you go to the market, we are looking at it that maybe if we have this microphone, if I'm holding the dollars, how much will the price be in dollars?
Okay.
So if the price in dollars tells me that if I'm having about $200 or maybe $150, I can buy this. How much of the cedi would I need
to buy this
to be able to buy this without the market indicative exchange rate?
Okay.
That will tell you the real exchange rate depreciation, and not the indicative. The indicative one is demand and supply of the currency.
Okay.
That is, the more people demand the currency, the more the price actually moves up. Or the shortage or scarcity of the currency that actually influences how much they sell it from the local Forex Bureau. Okay. But when we go into the international market, then that we get to know. For example, if a car is sold at $10,000, how many cedis do you need that would equate to $10,000?
So
you might need
about 80,000 Ghana cedis.
Very good. And what is the component of 10,000 to 80,000? Calculate the mathematics and see the ratio. That is what we call purchasing power parity.
Okay.
Because if it is $10,000, and then we are looking at the unit, the currency unit, matching unit to unit.
Okay.
So if it is 10,000 in somebody's currency, and in my currency, it's about 80,000. All that I need to do would be to calculate the 10,000 as a ratio of the 80,000, unit by unit. And you realize that you might be going almost about 70% or whatever it is per your calculations. So that is the real purchasing power parity that we do assess. So therefore, it tells you that when it comes to real exchange rate, the cedi has depreciated far more than the indicative rate that you have it at the forest bureaus. It's one of the major important things.
So our city is weaker than we
It is much more weaker than what your forest bureau and the Bank of Ghana is telling you, because what they're telling you is an indicative market rate.
Okay.
But when it comes to purchasing power rate, you'll be looking at the strength of your currency against the strength of others' currency in the common market when you want to buy things. That is a consumer price index. Okay. If you really want to look at it, that if we're going to the same market and somebody is coming from a Eurozone or is coming from a dollar zone and I'm coming from a city zone, how much of the units of my currency do I need to carry? And how much of the unit of his currency does he need to carry for we to buy the same thing?
For what we are seeing in terms of the CD, because I think that has translated into this price hikes that
volatility.
We are seeing. Yes,
that's correct. Now, this is what actually happened. You see, when you have an economy and the economy doesn't work, the managers of the economy doesn't understand the dynamics of the economy, this is where you always find yourself too. Let me tell you a typical way. Usually, this is the way we operate economy. The economic pillars, which is quite much more stronger and being moved and led by the central bank and the finance ministry, is that both of them must have the same perspective. They must have the same goal. They must have the same achievement. But over the period and over the years, what you realize is that while the monetary policy being headed by the central bank is moving through a different angle, then you also realize that the Ministry of Finance is moving from a different perspective. And let me tell you a typical example. After the COVID-19, the government came out with a policy, and the policy was that they want to soothe the economy. They want to take the economic pains a bit more down. Okay. Certainly, I told you that, and I have said in many platforms that that decision is very porous because they have a confused policies. One of it had been this. The central bank went ahead to reduce the policy rate to 14.5%. Yeah. With an aim that they want to allow people to be able to borrow because you need money. The mechanism that you use and run the economy is your financial system. Okay. So if you want to use your financial system, then you reduce the policy rate. Okay. And then they went ahead to also say that because of that, they are even reducing the reserve rate, which means that the reserve banks are supposed to keeping the banks, keeping the central bank, had been reduced down to allow the banks to be able to have money. I came out with a publication that was quite wrong, and it was unfounded because that is not the way to run it. Now, once the government brought up these two policies, at the same time, the Ministry of Finance was hinging on how to increase more taxes, was looking at how that VAT had to be increased. And they tried to increase the VAT, and the VAT was hovering about 19-point-something% because they've added more. They've equally made sure they maintain the petroleum taxes, and they added a little bit more. Now, you see, you can't suit in an economy while one other function of the state, which is the central bank, is reducing reserve rate and reducing, policy rate, while the fiscal policy headed by the finance minister is busily increasing taxes. It doesn't work. That system doesn't work.
Okay.
Yes, because one, the Ministry of Finance concentration had been that they wanted to be able to raise revenue to be able to pay off their liabilities, asset margin. Yes. And the focus is that they should be able to have further borrowings in the market to be able to increase up their threshold and then go to the market again and borrow. Yeah. So because of that, that is their focus. While the central bank's focus is that they want to reduce pain. How can these same two institutions have a confused policies? One is looking at how to suit in other people's condition. One is looking at how to pay liabilities. And because they want to pay liabilities, he decided that they have to increase more taxes, while this guy is reducing policy rate. But the most confusing part of it all is that while he's reducing the policy rate, then the Minister of Finance jump in there and go and push the central bank to issue out bonds into the market. Now, when you increase taxation, the problem that comes in is that, as I already said, the final consumer bears the cost of the taxation. So what definitely would happen is that Once you're doing that, the banks becomes also very careful releasing money to the private sector, because if you give it to the private sector, you could be trapping yourself liquidity-wise. Okay. The money will go and they cannot pay. So your NPL or your non-performing loans would be increasing much more higher. So as soon as they hear the government is selling bonds, then most of the financial institutions move their money, took advantage of a low policy rate to buy the government bonds. So this comes to kill in the Bank of Ghana's policy of trying to reduce policy rate to allow money to go to the private sector.
Okay.
Very good. So typically when you come down to the local parlance, they will tell you, Mami Budundu Papesa. It's like it's like the parents are doing their own thing. Yeah. The children are starving. That is the way it goes. So the economic analysis from fundamentally where it go was absolutely risky. And in January 2015, I released this document. I called it the Country Risk Assessment of Ghana. Okay. This Country Risk Assessment of Ghana. And in the portfolio, you realize that almost everything, their financial activity is associated with risk. The overall debt sustainability was at risk. The fiscal debt dynamics scorecard is at highly risky. Their debt composition is more riskier. Their budget balance was extremely risky. Their primary balance was highly risky. Their actual stabilization primary balance was highly risky. The public debt of GDP was risky. Their debt service of GDP is extremely risky. Their debt service of revenue is extremely risky. The effective interest rate was extremely risky. Their external percentage of total debt, the short-term external percentage of total debt is risky. Their public external debt service of revenue is highly risky. How do you run a country like that?
So you saw risk in everything.
I saw risk in everything that they did. Risk in everything. Everything that they did. Now they've also realized the risk. And when they realized the risk, what the finance minister decided to do was that the finance minister decided to make sure they kept on jumping interest payment into 2025. They made sure repayment are moving. Sana, let me tell you something. The African Development Bank projected Ghana's growth in 2022 to 4.1%. Would you be surprised if I should tell you the interest payment that is supposed to be paid alone to GDP is 8%? It means interest payment is higher than your economic growth. Interest payment to GDP is 8%.
And what does that mean?
And your economic growth is 4.1%. What it does means is that it's like you are not performing and you still want to leave. It's like somebody who decides to say, okay, fine, I really want to, I'm running a business. And then my business suddenly brings me a profit of, let's say, 2 cedis. But however, I would like to live within 100 cedis because your expenses is far more. You want to live within 100 cedis, or you want to live within 100 cedis when your actual revenue is just 20 cedis. That means that 80% of it is a liability. Our real economic output is going to be 4.1%. And if it's going to be 4.1%, and we are paying an interest alone without principal, 8% of GDP. Can you imagine the type of economy, if it is not economy that you're going to run aground? Where are you moving to? And let me tell you, as at that very beginning, let me tell you Ghana typical performances, which I had written down in my analysis. And it would surprise you that Ghana had been very, it was very too weaker and too porous before we even started the year. Ghana joined 13 worst economic performing countries in the world in the last November, that's in 2021. Ghana ranked 4th with a district sovereign U.S. debt behind Argentina, Venezuela, and Lebanon. Ghana ranked 3rd as a worst performing emerging market hard currency sovereign bonds. The first worst performing country was Bahamas, and then that declined by 0.19, and then we have Argentina, which declined by 7.5%, and Ghana actually followed suit. Ghana is the 5th worst performing emerging market economy in the world. And then we have the list, which is Argentina, Angola, El Salvador, Ethiopia, Ghana, Sri Lanka, Ukraine, and Zambia. And if you look at, indeed, this clear analysis, it tells you that the Ghana economy had been somersaulted upside down. And this is purely based on the fact that this is what we call mismanagement. When we say mismanagement, I'm not talking about corruption. I am not talking about pilfering and stealing. But this is what I'm talking about is that the managerial competence of the two institutions, Ministry of Finance and the Ministry, the central banking, doesn't necessarily seem to have the adequate skills to be able to turn the economy up to date. And because of that, the economy situation is absolutely a mess.
So what you're assessing is their
Yes.
competence in the management of the economy.
Of the economy
in
itself.
terms of the policies that they introduced
Instead
over
of
the period.
policy outrage and then responses of policy, because this is the way we have them. Let me start from 2018, when they did started with the banking sector financial crisis. That was one of the pillars, and that was part of my analysis and my lecture was based on that.
Yeah.
And I said the situation Ghana was facing by then was a systemic crisis. And usually when you have a systemic crisis, you don't treat it as a typical financial crisis. Don't deceive yourself. If you treat it as a typical financial crisis, you will cause economic catastrophe.
Okay, so explain the systemic crisis for me. What did you see in the bank that made you feel that it was a systemic crisis?
Very good. The kind of report that was released by the central bank with regards to the performances of those banks, the third-party borrowing that has to do with, let's say, owners of the companies borrowing to another companies and so on and so forth. When you come to finance and economics, what we know about this is what we call a behavioral crisis, and that's what we call systemic. It cut across. When there is a systemic, what we do is that the approach is not to remove licenses. The approach is not to collapse the banks.
So you have to deal with behavior.
It has to do with behavioral.
Okay.
We really have A to Z from all the comments that they gave.
Okay.
It is purely of behavioral.
Okay.
That had led us to this point. And now it hasn't even solved. The problem, as I'm talking to you now, why should EcoBank and UBA would be downgraded in the international capital market? Because of their exposure to the government. So what was the moral right of the government having to do by collapsing and revoking people's licenses, realizing that they might have given out loans and non-performing loans are killing the banks? Now, this is one side of it. Banks, when economy would grow, it is the people that grow the bank, grow economy.
Okay.
It's not a government.
Okay.
And the way economy grow, it takes through the financial system, because it is the credit that makes the economy grow. Once people have money, the economy will grow. When they did that, the shallow and quite a bit of worrying position is that they were looking at it that, and that is where I feel that I'm sorry to say, their economic acumen could have been called to question. Because if you say that we have saved depositors' money, and the way we've saved depositors' money is that the 21 billion that we injected into the organization, and then we paid off them after 2 years, had been that we've saved their sweat. Now any other economic person with a good intent would say that one, not being political.
It didn't make sense to you?
It doesn't make sense economically. And let me tell you why it doesn't make sense. Senna, let me tell you something. Money goes in pendulums when you come to economic orientation and economic growth.
Okay.
That is the way money flows. If you hold up the money, even up to 3 months, the economic decline would be much more disastrous, because the GDP is not calculated based on what the government is able to build.
Okay.
It's based on what the citizens are able to build and their output.
Okay.
So when you stifle a small economy like Ghana, with a total GDP hovering around $72 billion, and you are able to hold cash, actually cash, not credit, cash, half year getting to 2 years, you collapse the economy. Now, let me tell you why they're suffering now. Once you withhold that money, the challenge is that financial transmission into the economy becomes standstill.
Okay.
Because money is not in the economy. You've taken some money out of the economy. Though when the banks were not closed, the banks were not run over by the people. When they go, they get small money, and they could be able to arrange. And there was predictability. They could predict.
Okay.
Once you close it and didn't know when to get the money, there was no predictability. And that will suddenly affect the businesses. So businesses went down.
Okay.
And when businesses went down,
Even people died.
yes, many people died.
Yeah.
Economic situation became so difficult. When economy became so difficult, production went down completely. When production went down completely, then you have an external assessment that came up to say that your revenue base to your GDP is hovering around 12.5. Then you get up and say that, then it looked like we are not taxing well. But you've forgotten that when you withheld the money, production levels went down. And once production level went down, it will affect the government's own revenue. If you remember those days in my lectures, that's why nose to spite your face. Once you kept your nose, suddenly you will look as ugly as you are. And there's no way you would be able to get it back. So the challenge became that when the government introduced that, the country growth started having a nosedive. It went down completely.
Okay.
It went down completely. Ghana's GDP calculation, I will say on this radio, that it has been falsely calculated. And then if you want to do a proper calculation of the GDP, a size of Ghana probably should even be a little bit much more bigger than this. But because we are not taking much more individual output, for example, if you go to Europe, people who sell on the street, their output is calculated as part of their GDP growth. In Ghana, no, they don't do that.
Oh.
Yes, they don't do that. So as
there are thousands of hawkers on the
hawkers on the street. No, they don't do that. Now, once they don't do that, I'm telling you that there's a lot of skills gap in the country, and that has really led us into where we are. Now, if you had calculated that, you would have realized that GDP growth coming from that sector and coming from the retailing and the people in the market, you would tend to realize that GDP growth would have had a very huge nosedive coming from that area because of the implementation. People and the ordinary people are going to be suffering. And when ordinary people suffers, your taxation would suffer as well. So if you go back there, then you come back and you realize now production is not growing. Then you come and say, okay, now what I really want to say is that your own capital, the money that you're transferring to your brothers and your sisters, I am going to tax you. And that's what is going to be called e-levy. What kind of economic principle is this?
So the very first move you said they made,
yes,
that was wrong.
That was absolutely wrong. And the solution,
the bank, hold on to people's money.
Hold on to people's money
that
for
they would have
2
used
years
for other
production activity to grow the economy. Had been standstill.
Because a lot of the monies that were to, let's say, above 10,000,
yes,
were not being paid.
Those
were monies that belong to businessmen.
They were paid. Most of them were paid getting to the election in 2020. Some of them were paid getting to election in 2020.
By that time they had lost value.
And by then,
the
economy had already taken a nosedive when it comes to those sectors. So you come back in 2021, then you have a headache. You're close up in the capital market. The capital market is not moving anymore. So there's no more capital market. What do the government need to do? Now government come back again and tells us that, oh, it is a speculation. Speculation that you're doing, that is the reason why the dollar has been influenced. But everybody knows that the government has been cut off from the capital market. And because the government is cut off from the capital market, government need to find alternative money to be able to pay a maturing debt.
Okay.
Now that the government need to find alternative money to pay maturing debt, what the government then decided to do is that they quickly have to now try to issue out domestic bonds. And while they are issuing domestic bonds, they are issuing domestic bonds denominated in dollars. So while these domestic bonds are denominated in dollars, now the challenge that we now have is that the dollar will now have to be running because we are not producing, we are not sending, we are not exporting. So the price of dollar would now have to be running as fast as possible. Then it turned out to be that most of the domestic bank, government is using the domestic bank. That should have been the pillar because the transmission of financial finance through the financial system into the economy, it is the lifeblood of the economy. Then these institutions that have got international clouds go out there, issue out their bonds, bring their bonds money into Ghana. They don't know where to invest than to buy government substantial bonds. But you know the challenge even with that is that while they had bought government bonds at least in 19.5, then we move into April. Then you realize that year-on-year inflation is running about 45.6. That's why the fact that the Statistical Service and the Central Bank came out to say that it's about 23.6%.
Okay.
you realize that when you take it year on year, not just month by month, but year on year, the whole thing has gone to it's almost run into about 46%.
Okay.
Now, once the inflation runs that way, then you look at inflation as against your income, as against your investment savings as a bank. So the challenge is that if you had bought a government bond at 19.5 and the inflation is running at 46, it means you are running typical real cash losses. That's a challenge. Now, what also happened and what thickens up the economic condition and make the economic condition more worse? One of the things that make the economic condition more worse is that now pension funds, which has actually been pegged, let's say pension funds with investment of, let's say, 6% or 10% or 8%, they are all bewitched before you grow old. Because when you grow old, before you grow old, inflation has eaten up all the comparative interest rate that has been calculated on your investment. Now, the other challenge is that if you want to do insurance of your vehicle, and you did insurance of your vehicle last year or last 2 years with a retired value of, let's say, 70,000, hoping that maybe at the end of the day, if the car get an accident, you'll be given 70,000 to be able to go and get a new car. Before your car get an accident, they'll give you 70,000, and you cannot buy a new car because inflation and exchange rate would have affected the whole value. So the standard in which you were before the car got off, you cannot go back to your former state.
Okay.
You will be worse off than your former state. It doesn't also end there. This also brings banks' portfolio absolutely down. And what exactly is going to also happen is that non-performing loans are going to be more because while the inflation goes up, you need price adjustments through the financial system to be able to make sure you take care of this. So that would tell you that borrowing cost, factoring in inflation rate, would be so high. And once inflation rate is so high and borrowing cost is so high, it would never be attractive for an industry to borrow. If an industry borrow, the challenge the industry is going to have is that the industry is going to have something we call a liquidity trap. Liquidity trap is where the money is available to be given to you, but you don't have the buyers to buy for you to generate the money and pay off your loan. So that would end up collapsing the financial system of the economy. So as we lead or as we stay now, the economy is totally and completely messed. The most annoying thing that when I hear, I get much more upset is about jumping on to Ejapa to collateralize your gold royalties.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense if you have actually, and you understand economics, or you understand finance. Most of the developed countries, they use gold standards in any form to be able to peg up with the currency strength.
Okay.
That is how it's done. And if you're blessed with a country with the natural and natural resources, with gold, and your central bank is not even running effective and efficient gold reserves, and they have actually made your gold a galamsey hub, it tells you that the people who are running the economy does not necessarily understand the economy. They don't know what the economy is all about. And they try to mess up the economy and mess up the citizens. The situation that we're confronted is not just merely imported, but it is out of the fact that the competence, skills, and the knowledge that we expect from those who manage the economy doesn't necessarily have it. They are clueless about economy management. It is true, and it is factual. At this point that we've gotten to, the question that we ask ourselves is that, which way forward are we moving? What happens is that when you have a cost-push inflation, a cost-push inflation is the attribution that they've been given to themselves. And when you ask them, they tell you that because of COVID, because of the importation of oil, because of Ukraine and the Russian war that has actually put us in this back burner. It is very, very irresponsible to hear such words from economic managers. The reason is simple. When inflation was to spark, it started somewhere, it gives you a whole lot of signs. This started somewhere last year when the Fed said that, look, inflation is likely to spike because of the injection of $1.9 trillion into the United States economy. Okay. And based on that, what they need to do is to adjust their policy rate a bit upward. And if they have to adjust their policy rate a bit upward, and you are a country most exposed to the international market, what you need to do is to come back home and then do your homework well. As I'm speaking to you, Nigeria is much more better than Ghana when it comes to inflation management into the economy. Now,
what have they done that we've not done?
Very good. You see, the inflation has got levers. We have two other angles that we use in solving inflation situation when it comes. That is by identifying what factors are driving that inflation.
First thing you need to know.
To know as to what factors are driving that inflation.
Okay.
Because inflation doesn't just come like that. When you have a lot of supply of cash into the system, it could spike inflation, but this is not the type of inflation that we're talking about.
Okay.
When we have demand going high than supply on certain products, inflation will certainly go high. Okay. Then, if the inflation is as a result of imported ones, like you were not prepared for it, and then the inflation comes as a cost of maybe, let's say, war had happened in one way or the other, what you critically look at it is that if the fuel prices is going down, the first thing you do would be to take taxes off that particular products immediately. That's what you need to do. The second aspect of it is that government would have to subsidize the commodity prices, those driving factors, to make sure standard of living comes to a much more meaningful position. Government could not do this. And government has every right and opportunity to be able to do it. The sad aspect of it is that government is looking at this that is going to crash because of the tax foundation, because of the tax requirement. So now, Ghanaians will now have to understand that the poor are working for the rich. And why would the poor work for the rich? The poor people are working, and the investors who have their money to invest in the country are taking the poor people taxes, pricing on fuel and oil just to be able to pay them their returns, as against the poor individual Ghanaians who are here. And let me tell you, we have the protest risk analysis that was done, and this was done internationally. And then you realize that protest risk analysis projected Sri Lankans' situation year on year to 22%. And 22% means that that is the worst scenario and the threshold that people could stand. And at that point in time, if you're not careful, there will be social tensions and there could be demonstrations.
Okay.
When you calculate that of Ghana, Ghana is 21%, just 1 point notch below Sri Lanka. And that tells you that Ghanaians are now suffering and the situation will become much more worse. And if you're not very careful and you didn't manage things well, you would then see people on the streets. And that's where you realize that the government is getting out of control. The management of the economy at this point is purely lack of skills, lack of knowledge, lack of ability to be able to see how to turn a disastrous economy around. And all the excuses are so flimsy, and it doesn't make sense. The economy is in tatters. The best way we could do would be a total restructuring of this economy. If not, Ghanaians will suffer more, and the situation will be more dangerous than we think.
Dr. Jerry Monfant is External Monetary Policy Advisor to EFRAG, and his opinion is that what we are seeing currently is as a result of incompetence, which means that the people who are running the economy don't know what they are doing. There's a confusion of policy from the Bank of Ghana as against that of the Finance Ministry. And there are several people who've disagreed with this government on a lot of this. I recall one of the proposals that was made to the government was, why won't you reduce the taxes on fuel? The president says that will cost them 4 billion, 3 billion to 4 billion cedis. And at this time, they can't afford that.
That means that they don't understand what economy is. Economy is about the people. Economy is about people trying as much as possible, increase their productivity, make a reasonable profit.
But can you also afford to lose money so that you not be in the position to pay for
it is
to
actually,
pay the interest rates that you
it's a backward thinking. The reason why it's a backward thinking is that it is two-way. Pay off the liabilities of the people that you owe and let your people suffer and your economy will collapse. These are the two-way front end.
Okay.
Let me give you a typical example. When the financial crisis started in 2007, 2008,
okay,
Iceland took very unusual position. And the position that Iceland took was that Iceland was having banks in Dutchland. They were having banks in the Dutch country, that's the Dutchland, and the Netherlands, and then the UK.
Okay.
What they did was that as soon as they realized that the portfolio of the bank has grown more than 10 times the GDP of the country, and at this point in time, The banks can no longer cope, and the government cannot pay the liability. The government decided that I want to nationalize almost all my banks. And this is more developed country in Europe. They want to nationalize. They were within the European community, but they are not hooked up to euros. They spend krona.
Okay.
So they decided that we would not do it. And when they moved forward, what they did is that people who were owing the banks, the creditors, and who are businessmen, the government canceled off all the debt. They voted the first government out. And the new government canceled almost all their debt and made sure they gave them a fresh capital. Within the period of just less than a decade, Iceland has almost doubled their GDP. That is the way economy grows. We run economy with our senses. We don't run economy with an impulse. And the most important thing is that if you're very predictive and you have the forecast instincts, you always have to foresee problems before they befall you.
We're not doing that?
No, if the president is saying this, it means the president was not well briefed. The president was not well guided.
And I think perhaps they are taking the path that you are cautioning against, that we'll focus on paying the liabilities.
Yes,
interest and all
that's
those
right.
things. Whatever happens to the economy is not
there is none of their problem. But the question even that comes in is that who went in to take the loan? What did you use the loan for? Did what you use the loan for, will it be able to work and pay for itself? If it can pay for itself, then the nation doesn't have a problem. But if you had borrowed the money and purely use it to share it and consume it, then the challenge that we're going to have is that it's quite unfortunate. Then the problem that we find ourselves is very terrible. And now you tell the poor person who does not have access to proper public toilet. Meanwhile, you've contracted a loan. You have the same poor person who doesn't have a better road network within his community. You have this poor person who doesn't even have a better educational system and better educational infrastructure within his own community. You have this person that you've not provided levers for them to even be able to farm and turn around the economy. Now you go and tell them that, you know what? The loan that I took, I am in a mess. So because of that, help me to pay that loan at the expense of the fact that the farmer doesn't have any alternative or doesn't have any other source of even raising a financial or credit. When you look at developed countries that you go there to borrow, the United States economy actually is influenced by the Fed. If the economy would grow, is determined by the Fed. Okay. And what they do is that they realize that there were two ways that they look. Let me tell you something. Look, we Africans. We are proud of ourselves. We are blacks, but we are not proud of our leadership, and we are not proud of the way people run the economy. United States realized one thing: that if I had to pump money into Ford, or pump money into the aerospace engineering, or pump money into production of shoes, then the opportunity that I'm going to have is that these industries are going to grow. But the next question that economists would ask the government of the United States is that if you give the money to, let's say, Ford auto manufacturing company, and then you give this money to the aerospace engineering companies to manufacture, the next question is who buy those products? If you build mortgages, you build better properties within the United States, who is going to buy those properties? The answer would be the citizens. How do the citizens get money to buy? Then it's a stack. Then the government decided that no, then we have to introduce a credit system. And that's where they introduced a credit card. Such that if you don't have money, you can buy what you want. The reason is that you want to boost consumption to drive economic growth. So you're handling the things two ways. You're looking at the industry and you're looking at the consumption part. So you're handling the consumption up and you're handling the industry path. So at the emergent point, the economy will have a spark of growth. But if you are a country and you come to sit back and say that you are not even putting the money into the manufacturing sector, you're saying that I need the money to pay a loan and not to produce and not citizens to buy to boost up your economy, then it suddenly tells you that your understanding of the economy is much more too down. It's far below the standards. The reason being that as we're doing, let me tell you now, the challenge is that as of 2021, the percentage of interest rate that was used in paying loan was about 55.9%.
Okay.
In 2022, at the end of 2022, it's projected to be at 63%. In 2023, it's going to be 67%. I am telling you all these forecast figures. 67% of a total revenue. So it means that every point in time, your interest repayment is going to be climbing more higher, and higher. But you're not thinking about the fact that the person who should have paid the revenue is struggling. You don't know that. And let me tell you, just because of that, before we get into 2024, the disaster is going to, because this situation is not going to die anytime soon. And because of that, the government has resorted into borrowing within 12 months and 24 months. 24 months, 24 this month. So, and measuring, pushing up or front loading almost all the interest payment and the principal repayment into 2025. And if you remember the kind of caution that I gave at the time when I granted an interview to you, I said any government waiting in power or waiting in opposition should rather start planning out how to unravel the situation. Because what is going to happen is that in 2025, we are likely to face a very huge disaster, especially within the first 6 months. Interest rate, apart from the interest rate factor, what is going to happen is that depreciation of the currency is going to be too high. And that will be very difficult for we to catch up. So if you have any government in opposition waiting, the government, this is the critical time. You should start planning and putting your foot down and seeing what you're coming to meet. Because if not, the tensions, the situation are difficult. The protest risk will be much more higher than we do anticipate. This government has actually disappointed almost everybody. We thought they had the economic gurus. We thought they have the people that they think. But when you realize that, when you started having a confused monetary policies together with the fiscal policies, then you tend to realize that the economy is not going to be something that is going to sustain.
Let me conclude this 9:57 now. Let me conclude by asking you about the e-levy. You already referred to it. We've started paying it.
Okay.
Yeah, after resistance, they are still able to charge it. Now they are saying part of the e-levy will be used for to support enterprises. They'll give them loan, among others, to support youth, to ensure they create their own employment. I'm sure you've read all that. How does it sound to you?
It sounds like trying to tell quite a village people who doesn't even know what the system and economy is, trying to tell them what kind of promising that you have to do. It is quite unfortunate to belittle your citizens up to this point and making the citizens feel like you can just take them for a ride at any point in time. What the government said is absolutely not true. And it cannot work to revive the economy. Now, the question is even this. Granted that it's even correct that you are even going to use the money to give out the e-levy or to give out to the youth to even work by introducing all sort of factors. Which economy are they going to produce in? Because a youth cannot produce here at a competitive price. The cost-driving factors are too high. And if the cost-driving factors are too high, comparatively, items coming from Nigeria could be more cheaper than items coming from Ghana. So when you give the money to the youth, what you only do is that you kill their entrepreneurial spirit. Why? Because they are going to be flopping. They cannot do it. Because when we look at the economy, the speed rate of the inflation, how many times can you buy raw materials and go back again and have the raw materials at the same price? You cannot have it. So when you give out this money to the youth, what you're trying to do is that you're trying to sink the money, and it wouldn't work. So coming back to say that when you have e-levy, it could turn the economy, it's quite unfortunate. And it doesn't look like you respect the citizens. I think it's a high time we revert back and say that, hey, enough is enough. We have to stop at a point. The economy is at a serious tipping point. And the tensions that is growing within, the social tensions, are becoming so much. And we need to find a way out rather than coping with this kind of. I think if the government have to even remain quiet, it's better for him than to keep speaking on economic matters because it doesn't add up.
Dr. Jerry Combat Monfant, thank you very much for making time and for joining us today. Doc is a monetary policy advisor to EFRAG, and he came into town and we were able to drag him into the studio this morning. Doc has an entirely different opinion on what is happening. He says, we've made the decisions that has brought us here. So that is a simple, straightforward analysis of the current situation. He says we continue to make the same decisions and it will only drive us to chaos. We're already in crisis. you are getting into the arena of chaos. Doc, thank you.
Most grateful.
Thank you. I wish you all the best. And
thank you,
we should do this once again.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, a big thank you to my production team, Eric Boatin, Patrick Asford-Boyd, to my team, Nancy Amalos Gekelo Bimpe, Steve Mekua Ferewa, Ranzot Kwesi Buache, and of course, a big thank you to Alaska Bills in charge of Facebook.